Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Well, economically and pretty much in every other way, we are living in broken Britain, and increasingly people know it. But just have a little think about the economics of the situation. Taxes up to a post-war high, debt exploding, debt repayments becoming unsustainable, the explosion in sheer numbers of those living on a variety and range of benefits, totally uncontrolled mass migration, and certainly not selective migration, and people leaving the country. Not just the non-doms, but wealthy big taxpayers, young entrepreneurs leaving the country. It's a pretty grim situation. And that was all under the Conservative Party. But now we have a Labour government, and we have 8 very long days to go until the budget. I say long days because it just seems to go on forever and ever, and we get a brief or a leak of one kind, and then it's denied. And frankly, no one quite knows exactly what details will be in the budget, but there are a couple of things that we can predict, I think, with a very high degree of accuracy. The first is this budget, like the last one, will be an attack on aspiration, an attack on alarm clock Britain, an attack on those who get up in the morning. This budget will do nothing for the 5.6 million very brave men and women who act as sole traders or run their own businesses, without which the British economy, frankly, would grind to a halt. And I think we can say with some confidence that this budget will be very, very good for those who don't want to work and want to live on benefits, which is very different to a civilized society looking after those that are unable to look after themselves. And it'll be an attack on jobs. I have to say, I thought the budget last year, you can increase the minimum wage for young people, but if at the same time you bring down to £5,000 the level at which an employer starts to pay national insurance, is it any wonder that there are 50,000 fewer under 18s in employment today than there were this time last year, which culturally I think is an absolute disaster. What is clear is that the markets are increasingly nervous. I know that Andy Burnham thinks that doesn't matter, but actually the bond markets in the end are enormously powerful, as Liz Truss's government found to their cost. And amidst all of this, we have a Chancellor who is absolutely hopelessly out of her depth to a level that, frankly, it's embarrassing. It was Lee Anderson that called her Rachel from accounts during PMQs some time ago, and that really stuck. Although Lee now says he feels sorry for her on a human level, and actually, I think we can all understand that. So what we're going to get is a budget that'll be drafted by left-wing think tanks, a budget that'll be drafted by people who've never run a business, who've never had a proper job in their lives, and that's the level of disconnect that exists. Now, I do think we're setting the pace on a number of things. I thought, despite her protestations, I thought a lot of what Shabama Mahmood said yesterday was driven directly by fear that Labour are losing votes, particularly in the Red Wall, to reform. And rhetorically, we would agree with a lot of what the Home Secretary said. Indeed, there are some of us that thought it might just be a pitch. Maybe that's our next defector, I'm not sure. If her backbenchers vote against her, that could become a bigger likelihood. There was no doubt, as I say, that we led the agenda on that illegal migration is making the country very, very angry, and she said it's, tearing the country apart. But economically, it is legal migration that is doing enormous damage to the British economy, and it's been so difficult to even talk about this subject without being screamed down. But just look at the direct link between falls in productivity and the mass importation of unskilled labour. In fact, that trend has been there now for the best part of 20 years. There are enormous costs to our benefit system of those, not just illegally, but legally have come into our country. And today, Zia is going to address some of that, as indeed we've touched on before. The idea that will get put at an alternative press conference today, which I understand is going on at the same time as this one, is that somehow Reform support a ballooning benefits bill, and yet we're the ones proposing the most radical cuts to benefits in numerical terms that have ever been seen in the history of this country. So I'm going to ask Zia to lay out our key 5 points today. We'll then, of course, take questions on that and anything else, as we always do. But I want you to bear in mind, with all the numbers that Zia's about to give you, these are before the Boris wave, before the Boris wave begin to become eligible. And for everything the Home Secretary has said about extending the number of years you have to be in Britain to qualify, whether it's for ILR, whether it's for benefits, I don't see any changes happening to the Boris wave, and those numbers will start to hit by the end of this year, predicted by some think tanks to perhaps be one of the single biggest economic mistakes this country has ever made in its history. I'll now hand over for some of the details, although you might have heard them already on broadcast media this morning. I'll hand over to our Head of Policy, Zia Youssef.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming and for watching, if you're watching this on a live stream. So, tough decisions need to be made is the refrain of the political class for years, decades now. British citizens constantly being told that they need to tighten their belts and they've got to accept paying ever more tax for ever worse public services. While that's been happening, as we're about to lay out, there has been the most extraordinary ballooning of British taxpayer expense being funneled to foreign nationals, including on our own shores, that you could possibly believe. The British state exists to serve British citizens. That is quite a radical idea these days in Westminster, which is why Nigel gets heckled whenever he says such a thing inside the House of Commons. But that is what it is for. And so, yes, we agree. The country is in an enormous amount of debt, closing on £3 trillion, thanks to the Tories, almost tripled it on their watch. We basically have no economic growth to speak of whatsoever. Real wages have barely done anything for people in this country for the last 2 decades, and we've seen the tax burden on people in this country, tax as a percentage of GDP, at World War II highs. Again, as Nigel said, we can thank the Tory party for all of that. The question is, who is going to bear the brunt of these, quote, tough decisions? And here's our perspective. It is foreign nationals who should first bear the brunt before we ask any British citizens to make sacrifices. And that is the fundamental fault line right now in British politics. We are working incredibly hard to make Nigel Farage our next Prime Minister. And the reason for that is he will make every decision as Prime Minister, as will his Cabinet and his MPs, through the lens of what is in the interests of British people. So we have put together a suite of proposals that Rachel Reeves could enact immediately in the budget she's about to announce that would amount to saving and raising £25 billion, more than enough to plug the black hole that she has created through her mad policies and negate the need for tax rises. And in most of the proposals we're announcing, the vast majority of them, it is foreign nationals who are being asked to deal with the difficult decisions and not British citizens. So let's run through them. The first one is welfare. Now, we've already announced that our belief is UK welfare should be for UK citizens. I think that's an entirely reasonable position. And yet the fastest growing line item in any welfare bill you look at where we actually have data is indeed foreign nationals. And data is a key point. One of the reasons why the establishment is so worried about Nigel becoming Prime Minister is because we will no longer hide the data on all of the line items of the welfare budget and usage of the NHS by foreign nationals. The government, the Tory government and Labour now, continue to hide most of the line items in terms of how much demand there is on those services and welfare programmes from foreign nationals. The exception is universal credit. And yeah, universal credit has been ballooning in terms of foreign nationals utilising it. So we are saying we will no longer, the British state should no longer pay universal credit payments to foreign nationals. The bill for that will be, in terms of how much that would foreign nationals are taking from universal credit is £8 billion this year. We have assumed a 3-month notice period to be reasonable, and therefore if Rachel Reeves were to enact that policy, that would be £6 billion of savings this year. The next one is foreign aid. It is unconscionable that British citizens and taxpayers should be asked to fund foreign aid programs when, for example, 15-year-olds in Wales have a lower educational attainment than 15-year-olds in Turkey. And by the way, that number for Welsh 15-year-olds is below the OECD average. But I say Turkey for a reason, because the British taxpayer has been forced, because of the inept political leadership in this country, to send hundreds of millions of pounds in aid to Turkey, a country whose 15-year-olds do better than Welsh 15-year-olds. Charity begins at home, and that's before we even start talking about the fact that, for example, while Labour was resisting calls for a statutory national inquiry into the grooming gangs, they were wiring £19 million to Pakistan for child exploitation prevention programs. That is going to make British people's blood boil. It is unacceptable for us to continue to be funding foreign aid at this level while the country is in the state that it is currently in. Of course, we would aspire in the long run to do foreign aid. Why wouldn't we? But charity begins at home, and it is unacceptable to ask hard-working British people to pay ever more tax to fund these programs. So we are proposing a hard cap of £1 billion on foreign aid. That would still allow us to ring-fence our commitments to Ukraine, and it would allow us to keep our seats at multilaterals like the UN and the IMF. That would still save £10 billion a year. The next thing we can talk about is the immigration health surcharge. Now, this is actually quite extraordinary because the government's own impact assessment, when it was recently increased to £1,000 roughly a year, stated very clearly that £1,000 merely represented 38% of the actual per capita, i.e. per person, per year cost of using the NHS. That's literally in the document. That's not speculation. It's in the impact assessment. And yet the Tory government signed off on an effective 62% discount for foreign nationals to be able to use our NHS. And I'll give you just one example. And this is a very long document. It's online. You can go and read it. It's abundantly clear the government has actually got no idea how much the true cost of foreign nationals using our NHS actually is. But I'll give you just one data point to demonstrate why any sort of discount is totally morally reprehensible and economically illiterate. Let's look at maternity rates. The birth rate for foreign nationals relative to British citizens is about 30% higher. Each birth costs the NHS £5,500. That is one reason why, by the way, maternity wards, just like GP surgeries and many other parts of the NHS, are totally backed up. I want to give you another data point on the NHS, because we've already started doing quite a lot of work on what's gone wrong. And the fact of the matter is this: the population explosion has brought the NHS to its knees. Since 2010, the population in this country has grown by about 10%, roughly. And almost all of that, north of 90% of that, is through immigration. And what's happened to real, adjusted for inflation, NHS spending? It's almost doubled. It's almost doubled to deal with a 10% increase in the population. And insanely, and again, we can thank the Tory government for this, the country has fewer NHS beds since 2010. So it is clear that the marginal cost to serve in pretty much every vector in the NHS scales in really non-linear fashion, in exponential fashion, once capacity constraints are exceeded. And that is exactly where we are. Unless we get this population explosion under control, and Nigel has talked about this for decades, the NHS will not be able to recover. And that is really important. We can make a start. We can make a start by no longer offering foreign nationals a 62% discount on being able to use our NHS. We can then talk about foreign prisoners. So we've known for some time now that north of 10,000 foreign nationals languish in our prisons. And remarkably, countries like Pakistan, to whom this country sends hundreds of millions of pounds in aid every year, our inept politicians, for whatever reason, are unable to even get Pakistan to take back their convicted criminals who are sitting in our jails. And we're still sending them hundreds of millions of pounds in foreign aid and issuing them visas in all sorts of different ways. And then, so that would save £500 million adjusted for deportation costs. That's based on onward data that was published this week. And then you have the PIP announcements, the PIP reforms that Lee Anderson and I announced recently. Now, by the way, most of these numbers, Nigel mentioned ILR, the numbers I'm giving you, the 6 billion in the form of savings this year if we were to halt welfare universal credit payments alone to foreign nationals, the 10 billion saving in foreign aid, the 5 billion, by the way, that the immigration surcharge increase would raise this year. All of these numbers compound at dramatic rates over the coming years. Those numbers I've given you are just for this fiscal year because we're talking about plugging the black hole and negating the need for tax rises. But to give you an idea on this, in that press conference we said by 2029 the PIP reforms that Lee and I proposed would save £9 billion per year in 2029, namely no longer paying for non-serious anxiety but actually putting those people on back-to-work programs, which all of the academic research in Europe shows that is the best possible thing you could actually do for the recipients of that welfare too, many of whom are very young and being tossed on the scrap heap. But this year, that would still save £3.5 billion. So you top all of those numbers up, you get to above £25 billion. And these are savings that Rachel Reeves could choose to make in her budget that is coming up. We urge her to make these changes. And the fact that despite us doing this press conference and our pleas, the likelihood she will choose not to do those things and instead choose to raise taxes on British people is because Labour is making the conscious and deliberate decision to continue funding extortionate amounts to foreign nationals to the detriment of British citizens. And I don't know what to call that, frankly, in my view, is treachery. I think it's appalling. British people are sick and tired of it. So those are our proposals. We're pleading with Rachel Reeves. Let's enact these. Let's raise and save £25 billion, plug the black hole that you've created, and put British people first. Thank you very much.
Zia, thank you. And that is the central message of today's press conference, that putting up taxes in this budget is a choice. It's a choice the Chancellor is going to choose to make in whatever form, in the end, they manifest themselves. What we do know is that an increasing tax burden is demotivating, is sending more and more people abroad. And I really worry, particularly about the number of sort of 30-something entrepreneurs, people like him, who are leaving the country because they just really fear and worry about the direction that we're going in. And once again, I want to reiterate, we as a party are proposing massive cuts in spending, and particularly massive cuts in welfare spending. And we're the first people really to have the courage in modern times to lay any of this out. Now, as ever, we will take our questions, beginning with our favourite broadcaster, the BBC, and Alex Forsyth.
Thank you very much. You are talking again today about some pretty big numbers, 25 billion. Can I just press you on the workability of some of what you've announced? You said you would stop foreign nationals claiming universal credit, including those with EU settled status. That's protected by the withdrawal agreement. What gives you any sense that the EU would renegotiate that agreement? And if you say you'd act unilaterally, have you done any analysis of the potential costs when it comes to possible retaliation by the EU, including on trade?
Well, firstly on the point, on numbers, the last accurate figures we have are 2015, at which point there were 4 times the number of EU nationals in the UK getting benefits as there were UK citizens in Europe receiving any kind of benefits. But the numbers since then have exploded.
Yep, and so since then, the number of EU nationals in the UK claiming welfare has increased sevenfold. So the facts on the ground have changed. And therefore, look, we have a choice here. Either you have a government, which we've had now for years, that throws their hands up in the air and say numbers like, for example, foreign nationals claiming universal credit, that was 950,000 about 3.5 years ago. 3.5 years ago. That number is now 1.3 million. That's 350,000 more foreign nationals claiming universal credit in this country. That's happened in 3.5 years. So you tell me this, are we supposed to just stand by and allow that get to 2 million, 2.5 million, 3 million? Or are we actually going to say, sorry, we actually need to renegotiate this because this is patently unfair?
Well, I think the whole relationship with the European Union needs renegotiating. It appears that the Starmer approach is surrender, 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 starting with our fisheries, starting to make contributions again. I mean, the whole thing is mad. It is most certainly not what people voted for. And they were very, very clear. You know, Labour in the general election were very, very clear there'd be no backturns at all on our relationship with the EU, and there've been several already. But look, you know, the relationship clearly on this, and given the explosion of numbers, the relationship is hopelessly out of kilter. We'd like to negotiate something with the EU to show we're good neighbours on a reciprocal and fair basis. Jack Carson, next up from GB News.
What impact do you expect the increase in the NHS surcharge to have on waiting times? And is that money is that ever going to be reinvested into public services, or is that only ever going to be a saving for the public purse? And just on the Home Secretary's announcements yesterday, do you think that they will stop the boats?
Look, I thought that what the Home Secretary said yesterday in rhetorical terms was extremely encouraging. Extremely encouraging. It's just that in realistic terms, I'm not quite sure that it will survive her own backbenches and a vote in Parliament, and I can't see that any of it actually works. I mean, you can tell the judges, please interpret the ECHR and the Human Rights Act differently, but in practice you can't actually make them do that, given the current group that we've got. So, frankly, I don't actually think that most of what she said will make any difference at all. And as for the gimmick, you know, we're going to take away people's watches and earrings, and I mean, this is just never going to happen. And even in Denmark, which of course is what they were citing, even in Denmark, I think only 17 people have had valuables removed from them. And by the way, Denmark too, now beginning to struggle with its own policies directly as a result of the European Court of Human Rights. So look, rhetorically, fine, following very many of the things that we've been saying for some years, but in practice, I doubt much of it will actually happen.
Yeah, and on your question regarding the NHS, look, we've made this press conference, and our proposals are to plug the current fiscal black hole that Rachel Reeves has created so that it is not necessary for her to raise taxes on British people. With regards specifically to the NHS surcharge, you actually read that impact assessment. The changes we're proposing would not have that meaningful delta on demand. Even if it did, frankly, there's far too much immigration in this country.
Yep, thank you. Jasmine Cameron Chilesh, ITV News.
Thank you. Jasmine Cameron Chileshi, ITV News. You say these cuts will raise around £25 billion. Is it your expectation that if they go ahead, a reform government wouldn't have to increase taxes such as national insurance or income tax? And just secondly, if I may, the Home Secretary has urged you, Mr Farage, to quote, sod off after you suggested she was auditioning to join Reform. What's your response? And just to confirm, would Reform MPs vote with the government on their asylum changes if needed?
Yeah, I did notice actually Robert Peston arriving in the room just as we started. Well, she seems to quite like using bad language, doesn't she, the Home Secretary? There's been quite a bit of it over the course of the last 48 hours or so. I mean, look, for her to say she's not in the least bit interested in what Reform has to say is clearly utter rot. They're obsessed with what Reform has to say. Just look at every Prime Minister's questions on a Wednesday and look at the Prime Minister or every other front bencher that gets up in any single debate. And if Reform didn't exist, would she have made those announcements yesterday? No, she would not have done. In terms of the vote, and then I'll pass to Zia, in terms of how would we vote, well, in terms of the rhetoric, we support it. But in terms of the reality, why would we vote for something if we're convinced that it can't actually work? I also wonder, when will this actually come before Parliament in the form of primary legislation? Or is this just another, as we saw with Rishi's Stop the Boats, is it just another of one of these big performative exercises to say to the Red Wall audience, look, we're really with you, you don't need to go away and flirt with those ghastly Reform types. When is this actually going to come before Parliament? Because there are many other things this government have promised that haven't yet made their way through primary legislation.
Yeah, and listen, I would just comment, my personal perspective on this is that it was Keir Starmer who accused Nigel of being racist, if you remember. And I put it to you that if Nigel Farage had sat at a press conference and announced that a reformed government would start taking jewellery away from people coming across on small boats, Lord only knows what would have happened. And I take great exception to that, actually. I do take great exception to that. And I do also... One of the points about that particular policy is my view is clearly entirely performative, because I don't know who they think is coming across by small boat. It's not 50 Cent and Lil Wayne, and so therefore taking their gold chains away is not going to raise anything like enough money to make any dent on the asylum budget. But look, the savings that we have outlined here, as I said, we've put them together carefully because they are things that Rachel Reeves can actually enact. Case in point being, for example, we have put in a 3-month notice period on the ending of universal credit payments. These are things, these are not fantasy, these are real things Rachel Reeves could choose to do. And as Nigel said, these are choices Labour is making.
Yes, and it's before. It's before. Just look at the graph, look at the trend, look at those that will get benefit rights over the course of the next 3 years, and understand that the numbers we've talked about today will be significantly bigger by the end of this Parliament, which won't be in 2029. I'm pretty confident about that. Moving on, Tamara Cohen, Sky News.
Thank you, Tamara Cohen, Sky News. You're talking about finding these massive savings. Reform are in power in various councils. You promised massive savings then. They've struggled to find those savings, and many of them are looking at raising council tax. Why should voters feel reassured it'd be any different if you were in power nationally?
I did not make a single promise, not a single promise, in that election campaign that we'd be able to freeze or cut council tax. I never said it once. And do you know why? Because I realised the massive debts that we were inheriting from those county councils. It's such a shame. If you guys had focused on local government before the May the 1st elections, maybe the levels of debt would not have got as bad as they have. Now, of course, there's a huge focus on county councils up and down the country. Richard Tice laid out very clearly yesterday in a press conference the £330 million of savings we've already made, but he also made the bigger, broader point, which links actually directly into what we're talking about today, that there is a massive problem with the SEND budget, a massive, massive problem with the SEND budget. And this is going to need national government